Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Looks like we've got folks in the waiting room or have now joined us. I'd like to welcome everyone here to this event. My name is Nathan Ruggles, and I'm the podcast producer for the Battle of Homestead Foundation, and I will be moderating our event here today with our panel. So welcome to this event sponsored by the Battle of Homestead Foundation, Fascism in Today's America. Can it happen here? We have an excellent panel here today that will be discussing the spread of fascist movements in today's America, giving us a historical perspective, as well as talking about what's going on in the present and looking ahead, talking about how these movements can be a threat to working people and perhaps how these movements can be defeated. So I would like to go ahead before we get started and with introductions for our panel today to hand it over to the president of the Battle of Homestead Foundation, John Hare.
Hi, Nathan. Good evening. Good evening, members and friends and guests, and especially to our guest panelists. Welcome to the Battle of Homestead Foundation's 2022 program series. As Nathan mentioned, I'm John Hare, BHF Board President. Tonight, we'll again dig deep in the fertile soil of American social and industrial history. And through the magic of Zoom, we'll discuss a phenomenon our parents and grandparents knew well: fascism in America. And can it happen here? Looking back, we can ask, how are things different today? Looking ahead, we can ask, what's the future for our children? We are pleased to have three expert panelists, and I'll mention them again. Joe White, Chuck Panaccio, and Michelle Hamilton. And our moderator, as he mentioned, will introduce them to you further. I want to thank Larry McCullough and Chuck for their assistance in publicizing this event. And I do want to take a few minutes to tell people about the Battle of Homestead Foundation. Our founders, some 30 years ago now, were inspired by the dramatic labor conflict in 1892, the 1892 Battle of Homestead. The nation's eyes and the world's eyes back then were on the thriving industrial town Homestead, 22 miles downriver from Pittsburgh. There, the strong union, the amalgamated, had built powerful alliances within their workforce, the community, and the region. They knew they had to defend their labor contract and its first-rate compensation and work standards. Their employer, the Carnegie Steel Company, a monopoly steel coal empire controlled by Andrew Carnegie and his henchman Henry Clay Frick, they were determined to cut wages and break the union. And when the contract expired, Frick built a 10-foot-high wall around the mill, locked out the workers, and launched plans to import scab labor. The union then called a strike. On July 6, 1892, an epic struggle ensued, which, despite extraordinary resilience and militance by the workers, ultimately resulted in defeat for the union, even though the workers and the townspeople and the union prevailed over the 400 Pinkertons who had tried to land at the pump house in the mill on July 6th. That day, and for several days after, the union did prevail, and the workers and the townspeople prevailed. But ultimately, 8,000 state militia were sent in by the governor to occupy the mill and protect scab labor. And eventually, the struggle was defeated. The story of the Battle of Homestead in that day is a inspirational one. I'm not going to tell all the variations of it, There are many sub-stories and revelations within the entire epic, far too many to relate tonight. The more we dig deeper and learn, we discover and celebrate the seeds of hope in that resilient workers and community struggle. What are seeds of hope? Well, it's a story or discovery that another world is possible. The mission of our Battle of Homestead Foundation is to grow these seeds by promoting a people's history, but also we work to empower today's workforce and build strategies for a future that benefits all working families in our nation. Our goal is to develop a regional center and institute for labor history and the future of work. 3 years ago, the COVID pandemic forced us to change how we do this mission. Our public panels, historic commemorations, lectures, concerts, and drama are still presented, still this year, mostly online, although we have recently had in-person events and expect to have more. But the year is winding down. But actually, we have discovered in this time new opportunities to reach out, educate, fundraise, and organize. Today, the seeds of hope still sprout anew, even as our country faces major social, economic, and political crisis. But crisis can also mean opportunity. We have another opportunity coming up in 18 days. And it's not difficult to say that our subject tonight bears strong relation to the outcome of the midterm elections that happen in 18 days. As far as our perspective, since November 2020, we have begun to see the light. We take heart and recognize the tremendous organizing by grassroots groups throughout the nation. Many of these groups are women-led and often in coalitions with organized labor. This heroic effort in 2020 was the engine that expanded the electorate, giving voice to millions of average working people. Thus was propelled the election defeat of a mendacious anti-democratic president and his morally bankrupt enablers. But the hard-won progress is by no means assured to continue. And 18 days is going to be a benchmark in that. Tonight, we again celebrate creative grassroots workplace organizing, alliance building, and people's history. We're optimistic about our mission as we see the growth of power for working women and men in their communities. So we say, come join us. Now I'm delighted to hand the mic back over to Nathan and our guests. And I ask all people to bear with us while the presentations are made. There will be a question and answer period afterwards, and all views can be put in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. We appreciate, for those who may be attending today and unfamiliar with the Battle of Homestead Foundation, you certainly have a better idea now what the organization is all about. So I'd like to take a moment here. We're going to introduce our panelists and in turn. So they will be speaking in this order for 10 minutes each, starting with Chuck Pinocchio. He has spent 5 decades as an electoral and union organizer. He has served as the president of the One Payer States Network, a senior advisor to Healthcare for All Pennsylvania, a co-facilitator of Our Revolution PA, founder of the Justice for All Network, as well as producer of a film documentary, Fix It, Healthcare at the Tipping Point. He has taught history and politics at a number of institutions, including the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, Delaware Valley University, Texas A&M, University of Colorado, has authored several books, articles on European history, as well as U.S. history, healthcare, and politics. We also have Joe White, also a PhD, along with Chuck, taught at the University of Pittsburgh History Department for 39 years on a wide range of subjects. That included 20th century European history, British labor history, international working class history, and the Harmonious Society, as well as American utopianism. And then we also have with us here today Michelle Hamilton. Now, Michelle is the daughter of a Jamaican immigrant able to settle in the U.S. following immigration policy changes made possible by the civil rights movement. She is the former assistant director of shelter services at the Center Safe, also is the president of the Center County National Organization for Women, and she currently works in local government. So the only last thing I will say as someone who's been a student of political science myself in college, as well as worked in it for most of the last 2 decades, I can say that it is difficult for us as a group of people, such as here today, as a society, to have a discussion on a subject if we can't agree on the meaning of the subject. And there's lots of isms out there, whether liberalism, libertarianism, conservatism, democracy even, and in this case, for the purposes of this event, fascism. So I hope and I foresee that we are going to be enlightened today on what fascism really means historically, as well as in the present context. And I am certainly looking forward to hearing what our panelists have to say, and I hope you do as well. One last comment as far as housekeeping. Please, again, keep yourselves on mute during the duration here. And if you have any questions, we welcome your questions. Please pop those into the chat. Myself, as well as Larry McCullough, our operations director for the Battle of Homestead Foundation, will be curating those, and we'll be bringing up those in the Q&A, which will be following the 10-minute remarks for each of our panelists. So with that said, we're going to go to our first panelist, Chuck Pinocchio. Chuck, the floor is yours.
Hey, terrific. Thank you so much. And thanks to the Battle of Homestead Foundation for providing this opportunity for a critical discussion that really does need to take place. We need to come to terms with what's been building for decades and decades in this country, and the roots of which go all the way back to Columbus's landing in 1492 in the Western Hemisphere, and the genocide that occurred against Native Americans, and fast forwarding to the history of slavery and Jim Crow. All these outlines, Joe's going to go a little bit more in depth. And I also want to make sure it's mentioned here that the modern roots of fascism actually emerged initially with the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, during the period of dictatorship by Maximilian Robespierre, 1793 to 94. But my task for today is to provide a little bit more context. Thank you, John, for that, and Nathan for your comments. I just want to touch on a couple things that do need to be highlighted in addition, and then I'll turn to this document, which is entitled American Fascism 2.0, and explain to you why it's 2.0. We're in the midst, in my view, my judgment, we're in the middle of an ongoing fascist coup. It's happening in real time, and it started on January 6th, 2021. And I think it's real important that we wrap our minds around that, whether you agree with it or not. I think it's important that we wrestle with that, because what's spilled out of that has been this proliferation of lies, absolute lies, and gaslighting, and turning people inside out and scaring people with all sorts of volatile rhetoric. But it's the big lie, and it has a parallel in German history with the so-called stab in the back myth that emerged after the First World War, where women and socialists and Jews were accused of selling out Germany and losing the war to Germany, the First World War. So there are parallels here, and it's not a coincidence. We're also, of course, seeing the alarming rise of white supremacy, hate groups. Always good to visit the Southern Poverty Law Center. They track hate groups, splc.org. The rapid growth of with religious nationalism, it's not just Christian nationalism, but religious nationalism, where people are being told all sorts of mistruths, about the life of Jesus, and and what their religion means. The prosperity doctrine, these mega churches and so forth. I'll talk about that a bit in my presentation. And then after that, I'll get into a little bit of the psychology. Where does fascism come from? So let's pivot, if we could, here to this discussion of American Fascism 2.0. Why 2.0? It's 2.0 because it almost happened in the 1930s. And there have been other alarming periods in our history, but it came very close to occurring late 1933, 1934. And it's captured in a book. I'm going to flash it up here on the screen. I don't know how well you can see it. I'll put the link in later. But it's called The Plot to Seize the White House by Jules Archer. And it's the documented history of the effort of representatives from Wall Street trying to convince Smedley Butler, who was the previous adjutant general of the Marines, to essentially marginalize FDR. It wasn't clear what it was going to look like, but they wanted to insert Smedley Butler into power. And only Smedley Power rising up and blowing the whistle with journalists and politicians. And there were hearings. There were congressional hearings about this. And yet it doesn't appear in any mainstream history book. I didn't know about this. And I went through 17 years of high school and undergrad, and then on top of that, 9 more years of a master's and PhD. No one ever mentioned this. And I'm sure many of you were surprised to find out about Tulsa, right? And Black Wall Street just in the last few years. So there's so much of our history that's been hidden here. And it's really critical that we understand that should not go on. So let's go through American Fascism 2.0. 2.0 is that we're in the midst of a very perilous moment that could flip into fascism as of January 20th, 2025, if things go sideways the way they're poised to go, if we don't wake up and if we don't take radical steps to stop this. So my subtitle here is 3 cornerstones plus 28 characteristics. And I'll spend really the bulk of the time on the cornerstones. And I'll share this document with you all so you can take it and chew on it, and we can discuss it a little bit later. But I do want to emphasize that my background is in American history, European history, and diplomatic history. So I have taught this topic over the years. So just to pivot to this question of where does fascism come from? The term fascist is this idea of a bundle. It's the idea of a hatchet inserted in that bundle, and it came to symbolize strength, symbolize strength and authority, and it was used as the symbol of Mussolini's power, his dictatorship in Italy. So the term fascist is the term that gives us that arrives with fascism. I've already talked about fascism 2.0. We can come back to that later and get into that more if you wish. The first cornerstone of fascism is this is now American-style fascism. I want to be clear. This is American-style fascism, and that is state corporatism. And this is the cornerstone that Mussolini identified, and this is the merger and the marriage of state and corporate power, Wall Street, Washington, D.C., as well as power coming in from the Silicon Valley and so forth, other power centers, the role of lobbyists and money in our politics, Citizens United, and so forth. And it's a fused relationship with basically sociopathic, uber-wealthy donor class playing the dominant role, perhaps most notably led by the Koch brothers, now the Koch brother. But this is written about dark money, as well as Democracy in Chains is a very good book. You might want to note that one, Democracy in Chains. The second element here that I want to highlight is religious nationalism, which I just touched on a moment ago, but it cuts across fundamentalism with all the major religions, not just Christianity, whereby the dynamic relationships among and between the manipulative religious leaders, they drive home the need for obedience, to be God-fearing, and it's manipulated, it's fed, it's funded by the super wealthy class, and promotes and benefits their interests, by having these clerics tell from the pulpit what it is that their followers should be doing, and that's opposing things that they say God favors. God favors lower taxes for the rich and minimum rights for workers. The God favors deregulating businesses and rolling back environmental protections, as well as rolling back social safety net programs, because they're deemed to be unbiblical, and abortion is regarded as unconditionally evil. The third cornerstone is white supremacy. Now, I know that a lot of folks sort of writhe when they hear this term, but white supremacy is the belief that white people are inherently superior and should therefore dominate all others who are not white. That being Black, Indigenous, people of color, brown folks, immigrants, Jews, as well as those who identify as queer, LGBTQ+, these communities. And these communities are at risk, most at risk, by what many political scientists and historians are concerned about: the outlines of the Civil War, a modern-day civil war, a guerrilla civil war, targeting these more vulnerable communities on behalf of what is perceived as an under threat white race. You all are familiar with Tucker Carlson, the whole white replacement theory and so forth, which is a debunked theory. But nonetheless, it's gotten into the heads of a lot of people, including a number of my friends who I used to work with in the healthcare justice space. So this is penetrating pretty deep into our society. And then just to whip through here, imperialism is an element that falls out of these three cornerstones: land and cultural, financial, military, global empire. Let's see, I went to screen down here. Excuse me. Militarism, just going to go through this fast. Racism, sexism, xenophobia, cronyism, nepotism, the appointment of friends and family to positions of authority without proper regard to their qualifications. I mean, the Trump White House was filled with these people. The media control and manipulation. This has been coming at us for any number of decades, especially coming out of the Vietnam War going forward. I circle the year 1968 as the pivotal year. We can just discuss that a little bit later. Scapegoating, right? Blaming the other, people who don't look like the white people, who are blamed for all the problems in our society, when in fact the white collar crimes that are instigated by the super rich are deflected and neglected, as people who are in positions of vulnerability are dehumanized and diminished and demonized as foreigners, as aliens, as outsiders. Anti-democracy. This is, voter suppression, gerrymandering, electoral college, dark money, lack of civics education. You all know that civics has disappeared from the classroom virtually in this country. Bullying, violence, stolen elections. Victimology. This is a really important point here. And that is that folks take on this idea of victimology. If anybody happened to see it, Marjorie Taylor Greene at her debate the other night, she was charged with helping to instigate. She said, I was a victim, like all the other members of Congress. Like, she's playing the victim card, which is astonishing, but that's what fascism does. You play the victim card. Order above freedom, while at the same time claiming that freedom is what they're about. But order means, in fact, rolling back freedom in the name of defending freedom, rolling back democracy in the name of defending democracy. This is the manipulative lies that are thrown at us by fascism. Cynicism is the most negative and pessimistic of all ideologies here, and it's the core of fascism, cynicism, contempt for human rights, cult leader worship, myth, false narratives, outright lies. There's a lot to say here, but I mentioned a few before, how Hitler was able to convince a population of Germans that they had been sold out. And much the same thing, Trump has borrowed, and Trumpists, those who want to follow in his footsteps, especially if he stumbles, are doing the same thing with the MAGA crowd and telling people that the election was stolen, and more than that. Propaganda, playing on people's fears, anxieties, despair. Consumerism, materialism, right? Distracting people with consumerism, materialism. This is, it's what the bread and circuses that the Romans did back in the day. Toxic masculinity, patriarchy, warrior culture, anti-intellectualism. Turning science into something to be questioned, and anti-science, using this notion of critical race theory as though it's penetrating our K through 12 education, which is complete bunk. But people are convinced of this because of these crazy school board meetings that are being hijacked and taken over. White privilege, this idea that societal advantage should give white people privilege, right-wing tokenizing of BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, people of color, and queer folks, actually tokenizing. Think about the Candace Williams or the Candace Owens of the world, who actually are now running around wearing shirts that say "White Lives Matter." So it's the tokenizing of actual BIPOC community, winning them into the party of the Republican Party and having them masquerading. Outside wars, outside enemies, perpetual cold and hot wars, and then inside enemies. The Democrats, you must note that they no longer recall it the Democratic Party, they call it the Democrat Party. That's a pejorative that came to us from Rush Limbaugh. It's the Democrat Party. Leftist, Marxist, socialist, communist, non-fascist, just inside enemies, and targeted and expanded violence. And then that's essentially all that there is at this point. I'll stop right there and bounce it back over to Nathan and look forward to your questions. There's a lot to share in terms of what it is that we can do. I think I've really run my time, so let's do that during the Q&A. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Chuck, for summing up for us, certainly a very complex bit of, well, more than a bit, right, of a number of things that constitute fascism. So thank you for that. Everyone, I'm sure that's generated some great questions in your mind. Please drop those in the chat. We'll be pulling those out. Also look to the chat for other helpful links during the course of the program. We'll be dropping those in as things go at appropriate moments. So keep an eye on that. So now we're going to move on to Joe White. Joe, I know Joe's going to delve into some history for us, I do believe. Joe? Joe, I need you to get unmuted there. There we go. All right.
Okay. Hey, Nathan, thank you for such a kind introduction. Okay. The history of fascism is unfortunately rather complex and easy to be long-winded about. So I'm trying to fight against that as best I can. Okay. Most people nowadays, especially on our side of the proverbial barricades, think that things are going to get worse before they get better. Okay, some people call this hard right authoritarianism that's in store for us. Other scribbling and talking heads have no name for it at all. Okay, a few call it fascism. That includes us. Interestingly and significantly, our numbers are growing. Okay, this makes the fascists still very upset and angry, and they bleat and bloviate incessantly that we're not fascists. Nobody here but us woodpeckers. Okay, well, we, however, think that fascism is the most powerful concept for understanding what everybody is talking about and scared of, and it is our belief, which I wish there was just a little bit more evidence for it, that having a good historical grasp of things make them less fearful and frightening. So let's find out if that's true or not. Okay. The origins of fascism date from, as I see it, from 1919 to 1945. Okay, with a incubation period, as I'm going to call it, of 1870 to 1914. In the incubation period, the so-called new imperialism, scramble for Africa, surprisingly heavily globalized capitalism, globalization, but is simply not all that new. Scientific racism, anti-Semitism, the arms race. Okay, we're all cut their eye teeth in the period 1870 to 1914. But, and here's where things get interesting and ultimately get real interesting, this very same period was also the period of the rise of labor, okay, in Western capitalism, whose high watermark was, in, of all places, Germany. In 1912, when the German Socialist Party turned out to be the biggest vote-getting party in terms of members and votes in the entire country. Okay, so that a parliamentary road to socialism looked like being broad, straight, and leading exactly where history where people in those innocent days hoped that history would go. They were wrong. Far from leading to far from being a parliamentary road to socialism, we find a even wider road that led to August 1914 and the First World War. Wars sometimes lead to revolutions. The First World War was certainly one of them, and the one that most of us are familiar with. But there were two other revolutions at the end of the First World War, one in Germany, the other in Italy, and unfortunately, both of those revolutions were crushed and defeated. Had they not been, the history of the last 100 years might have been radically different and better, but that's a what-if kind of issue that I don't want to get into now. Okay, what I do want to get into is that Britain, France, and the United States remain bourgeois democracies. Not because liberalism was itself in such great shakes, it was not, but rather because they were on the winning side. In Britain, brutalized veteran soldiers were the core of the notorious Black and Tans hired by the government to fight against Irish independence. And those Irish patriots in the audience, and I know you're out there, will know exactly who and what I'm talking about. The Black and Tans, in turn, bore a family resemblance to the Freikorps in Germany, among whose exploits were the murder in cold blood of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. And indeed, in Germany, from 1919 to 1923, there were over 3,000 political killings. Okay. I have to turn now to how the fascists got in. The Great Depression, as a major cause of the fascist triumph, is played down a bit these days, and more than it should be, in my opinion, especially when we keep in mind that German unemployment in 1932 reached 40%. Okay, but equally important was the sheer weakness of liberalism in Germany and the deep divisions on the left. Okay, where the Social Democrats and the Communists, far from occupying two stories in the House of Labor, were bitter enemies. Okay, and a key reason, which we ignore at our peril, as to why fascism triumphed back in the 30s. Okay, who are and were the fascists, and in whose interest do they rule? Okay. Chuck has taken us more than 50% of the way, so I can be real brief about this. But we should not forget, and I don't think we actually do forget, that the leaders of fascist movements really are, many of them, scumbags, adventurers, and losers, and not exactly your 1% hedge fund types. A few military types thrown in for good measure, like Pinochet and Franco. A good friend of mine has called Trump a lumpen bourgeois, okay, which I think is a pretty damn good first approximation. Okay, but the real point I want to drive home here is that the 1% cannot rule in their own name in a in a country, in a society that claims to be democratic. Okay, because if they were to rule in their own name, that would make the plutocracy too transparent. Okay, so that it is no accident that the 1% or a significant part of the 1% favor and give aid and comfort and the ideological backdrop to out-and-out fascists and out-and-out crooks like you know who. Okay. Okay. Now the fascists, in their turn, however, are very clear-headed about certain things. they, in terms of their policies, they put the 1% first, workers and women last, and endless toxic culture wars surrounding everything. Okay. Thus the thus the thumbnail sketch of the 1%. My thumbnail sketch anyway. Okay, but what about rank and file fascists? Here, on the one hand, it is important to note and a real challenge that the support of fascist support cuts across class lines. But having said that, the petty bourgeoisie and insecure workers in declining industries are overrepresented. Also heavily represented and hardly ever referred to is that God knows how many hedge fund owners and other blowhards who scribble for the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal aren't very sympathetic toward fascists and fascism. So it's not just that white folks who happen not to have completed high school or whatever who are key fascist people nowadays. It's far more broader and more serious than that. Okay. In the 1920s and 30s, could fascism been defeated and World War II prevented? My short answer is this, but I don't have time for even a short answer, so I'm afraid we're going to have to say that for the question period. Okay, and instead move on to what I'm calling the intermezzo in fascist history, brought about by defeat and marginalization from 1945 to 1980. Okay, it took the bloodiest war in human history for a coalition of liberals, democratic socialists, and authoritarian socialists to defeat the fascists. And indeed, not until 1943 was it clear that the fascists would have the crap beaten out of them. Okay. But they did. Another reason for the marginalization of fascism was the fact that the Soviet Union, despite it having feet of clay, struck fear into the hearts of the capitalist class of Western society, who knew that they had to come in with some sort of democratic regime and some sort of welfare state. Okay, the United States was an admittedly skimpy version of that, of the welfare state, but the abolition of legislative segregation was also, and the formal dissolution of European empires were things that happened in this period. Perhaps most important was the long economic boom of 1946 to 73, which raised the real income of working people in Western capitalism to unprecedented heights. It was just too good to last. The Vietnam War, the end of the long boom, the election of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. First thing Reagan did when he got in was to smash the air traffic controller strike, whose union had ironically endorsed Reagan. Deindustrialization, endless war, 9/11, Iraq War, Afghanistan, the ambiguous administration of Barack Obama, on whom so many millions of people were hoping only to have their hopes disappointed. Okay. All of which then leads me to my final attempt at periodization, namely the rebirth of fascism, or the renaissance of fascism, 1980 to the present. Okay, big questions. Question number one, has a point of no return been passed? That is, does the possibility of decisively stopping fascism no longer exist? Okay, the short, sober, and I think accurate answer is, otherwise I wouldn't be saying it, was we literally do not know. Okay, and therefore have to proceed on both a logical and an existential level that there is that the point of no return has not been passed, and thank goodness I think we happen to be right about that. Okay, big question number two: is civil war in America a likely outcome? Okay, here again there are multiple issues rolled into one. One, why do the fascists threaten us with civil war? Okay, why doesn't anybody stand up to this political bullying, starting with the Democrats? Okay, yes, civil war is a possibility. Okay, but it will not look like our Civil War of 1861 to 5 or the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939. Revolution might be an outcome and a matter that we should discuss further during the question and answer period. Next issue, what will American fascism look like? In some areas of daily life, a kind of normality will in all likelihood prevail, but this will be punctuated by riots orchestrated from above. For example, Charlottesville and January 6th itself. Police murders will continue unchecked. Virtually all forms of protest will be banned. This will be common knowledge. Congress voted for post-World War II concentration camps way back in 1949. A seldom recognized fact. The fascists will fill their concentration camps with political prisoners, refugees, and other undesirable elements. Next issue, what kind of fundamental political, economic, and social changes will be needed to assure fascism's defeat? Okay, once again, the talking heads seldom go there, but we will. Ways must be found. Okay, we have to find the ways to engage what is still a clear anti-fascist majority of the American people. We need Bernie Sanders' political revolution and then some, starting perhaps with a new constitution, with the electoral college out, proportional representation in for start. Some parts of the Constitution of 1787 should be kept. For example, the Constitution contains no blanket defense of private property. A new Constitution that looks real and is real democratic on paper, however, is never the whole story. The Nazis didn't scrap the Weimar Constitution, they simply ignored it. Democracy is a case, if ever there was one, of use it or lose it. Our most urgent work then is to engage anti-fascist Americans who, to repeat, remain a sizable majority, up to and including nonviolent civil disobedience. Okay. Next to the last question of mine. What can we do in the immediate and middling term? Answer: stay tuned to this program for some very fine answers, so that finally there is a long and honorable and not completely unsuccessful historical record of men and women who fought fascism. We should follow in their footsteps. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Joe. We really appreciate that historical outline and perspective. I'm sure that's generated a lot of responses and thoughts from our folks here in the Zoom. Please remember to put your questions in the chat for Joe, whether it's about any of these eras of fascism that he has described, or perhaps about, where does that leave us now, right? So now let's move on to our final panelist, Michelle Hamilton. Michelle, thank you for being here as part of the panel. And it's your turn. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. And I want to sort of start by sort of bringing into the room briefly the lives of some people that we don't normally think about, but their stories are now being told. and that is the inmates of Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, who were victims of horrible medical experimentation done by the University of Pennsylvania with the total support of the city of Philadelphia, both of whom issued a very not real apology 50 years later. The reason that I'm bringing this up, there is actually a book about it called Acres of Skin that you can read, based on the fact that when UPenn researchers went to the prison and they saw the prisoners, they said that they saw acres of skin of people that they could experiment on. So you can look that book up if you want to learn more about it. But how it's relevant to this particular talk is that while the topic of this speech is, or this panel is, can fascism happen here? I really want to bring to the forefront that for many groups in this country, fascism has already come. And these Holmesburg inmates were, for them, fascism was every day that they were in prison, where these and other terrible and horrific things were happening. So I do want to sort of put a context in it because we are talking a little bit more philosophically and esoterically. But for many people that we know and don't know, the fascism is here already. It's just now being exposed as we learn more about history. And it's very important for us as workers and as activists to really look at history and the current day and elevate the lives of the people who seemingly have the least power, and also to elevate their activism. The second reason is that I'm bringing this particular group of people up is because of our prison industrial complex. So in our current prison industrial complex, and I think everyone on this call knows that we incarcerate the most people in the industrialized world, prison labor is basically just glorified slavery. And what that means is that what happens inside that prison industrial complex both affects the prisoners while making tons of money for corporations, and also affects us and so we as activists really need to sort of look outside of the traditional way we think of work and the traditional people that we see as workers, and really need to look at all the various ways that work, both paid, underpaid, and unpaid, is exploited in this country, which fascism and neoliberal thinking have sort of brought to a higher level. So that's where I want to start. So I want to talk a little bit about how fascism plays out in the workplace. We do know historically that fascist leaders such as Mussolini had very, very pointed attacks specifically on labor unions and any kind of organized labor. That's part of the history of fascism in many countries, including Italy and Germany. But fascism in the workplace is a smaller subsection of fascism in the general society. And since as Americans, culturally, we sort of define ourselves a lot by our work. Our work is literally the way we keep a roof over our heads. We get health care because many people, including myself, our health care is attached to our jobs, which is yet another reason to support healthcare for all, or universal healthcare. But it's also the way we define ourselves in relation to other people and to the culture at large. And because of that, we can have a tunnel vision around the work environment and things being done in the work environment and to the work environment by neoliberal capitalist interest and by fascist interest, and how that affects us emotionally, philosophically, and also politically. And how now neoliberals and fascists basically understand this, and they use this in various ways. They use various tactics to sort of control us as workers and keep us from trying to gain the economic, civil rights, and other things that we need. So I only got a few minutes, so I'm not going to be able to go over every single thing I wrote down, but I just want to hit a few tactics that are both part of fascism and also part of neoliberalist thinking around work. So the first one is using the frustrations of workers or the frustrations of a group of people to eventually scapegoat different groups and movements. So a regular frustration that I think a lot of us have is that when we're working and we're paying our bills, it definitely seems to me like we're getting less for what we're paying and stuff. It just does not seem to stretch as far as it did. And this was true even before COVID, and it's more true now. That's a legitimate concern and a legitimate fear for many families in this country. But what fascists and neoliberalists do is they take that, don't focus on the fact that companies are legitimately giving us less for our money, and instead scapegoat pro-worker movements and also scapegoat programs that help the poor. So there has been a big sort of anti-union movement and stuff, as well as sort of anger at people who actually want to raise the minimum wage, a big pushback that these people really don't understand economics, and that ultimately it's going to hurt the economy, not help the economy. There also has been a scapegoating of entitlements for the working poor, pushbacks to increase in TANF or SNAP, even though we know that over 50% of the people on these entitlements are children, and the vast majority of people who get SNAP benefits and other benefits are working. But there are racist, sexist, classist, and ableist stereotypes that are used to take a legitimate complaint that people have and say, oh, it's these people who are doing this and they're taking from you and stuff. If that person gets a raise and has a living wage, somehow that's going to negatively affect your life. The second thing is a contempt for weakness. So fascists sort of define who the weak people are. Usually it is some kind of either political minority, religious minority, economic minority, or like racial minority. And they encourage open contempt for these groups of people, including not really looking at their contributions to society or assuming that they have any value at all. So a sort of not political, but very political version of this is Ben Shapiro's famous comment that facts don't respond to your feelings, or facts don't care about your feelings, which he says to any group of people, whether it's members of the LGBTQ community, women, whoever, who want to engage him in any kind of discussion on anything, but particularly on how language is used and how society runs. This idea that fascist thinking is strong thinking and people who oppose it are weak, and you should disregard their feelings or what they're bringing to the table. We also see this from a work context and a lot of the ableism that still goes on in many of our workplaces. The fact that with COVID, many of the requests that people with disabilities, both visible and not as visible, had about working from home, working flexible hours, et cetera, that was before pushed aside as you're not really working. That's not really how it goes here. That can't be done, but it obviously can be done and stuff, and is now not seen as weakness. But when this particular group requested these things, then it was seen as them not fully wanting to work and as weakness. The third thing is using tragedy and chaos to bring order through oppression and through ignoring people's needs. So the biggest example of that is political that I can think of is the Patriot Act and various other things that came out of 9/11, where we took a horrible tragedy and many politicians, without even actually reading the act, pushed forward this act that basically expanded the surveillance ability of police officers and pretty much made everybody law enforcement to like intrude on our lives in various ways, as well as basically causing indefinite incarceration and detention of immigrants who are picked up on any reason, any charge. So in the immigrant community, one of the things that we fought against from then till now is the fact that detention rates went up, and also there was a indefinite detention and lack of proper you know, proper like things. So in addition to that, anyone who pushed back against this were seen as not being patriotic, not caring about the country, wanting something bad to happen. It was that you could not have a real actual discussion because the discussion had been taken over by these political interests, and they now defined the narrative, and anyone who went against the narrative was an enemy and someone who really did not have the best interests of the country at heart. So we see this sometimes in a work environment where a workplace might go through a traumatic situation like a bankruptcy or something, and they usher in rules and laws and stuff that actually put the needs of the worker on the bottom. And workers who want to talk about safety, workers who want to talk about diversity, inclusion, and other issues are told that that's not important. The only thing that's really important now is these new guidelines and rules so that this thing never happens again. And this sort of thinking, which sounds like it's not connected, but it actually is this idea of we're going to use a chaotic and horrible situation to introduce new rules and guidelines that will potentially take away rights. And your opposition to it will be seen as you opposing wanting what's best for the organization or best for the country or best for the company. Another sort of tactic of fascism is forcible suppression of opposition, or disagreement is treason. Basically, this idea that to disagree, if before in the past on a non-fascist system, you can have a disagreement, you can vehemently disagree, but at the end of the day, know what your right to work, your right to vote, your right to be seen as a full human being is not really, taken away. Under fascist thinking, it's the other. It's not just that this person has a different mindset than me, they see things a different way than me. It's that they are an enemy and their dissent is treason. And we see that in multiple ways and multiple things in the voter suppression that we see a lot of and are sadly probably going to see more of as it gets closer to election day, but also in the sort of, I want to say COVID wars, but that's what it was when our governor issued the lockdown. And I know not everybody was down with the lockdown. I'm not saying everybody needs to be down with the lockdown, but there's a difference between not agreeing with it and thinking that it's a bad political or even maybe economic decision and saying things like, he is against the state of Pennsylvania. He is responsible for all our economic problems. He is personally taking away my rights because he is talking about masking. Not to mention the situation in Michigan where people attempted to kidnap the governor because they disagreed with her mandates and her basically passing down guidelines that she had a right to pass down. So I can't think of right now and be within my 10 minutes of something like that within the workplace, but there definitely are situations where, workers have been whistleblowers and they have been seen as against the company because you're exposing the flaws, and they have been threatened and they have lost their job and their families have been threatened. So there is definitely a version of this within the workplace, but it's probably the type of fascist thinking that we probably see the most of right now, and is probably the most toxic because it shuts down any potential conversation, and people who dissent are literally seen as enemies. The not final actually, all of this comes from a few things. The first is basically a belief in natural social hierarchy. So fascists basically believe that there is a social hierarchy, that certain people are supposed to be on the top and other people on the bottom. Chuck talked about this earlier, and that it's natural. And so in fascist thinking, to promote civil rights or to promote LGBTQ rights or things like that is not just this is a different idea that I disagree with. It's you are going against the natural order of how things are supposed to be. And the result of that is that it has to be stomped out. It has to be stopped. This natural social order also sometimes affects us in the workplace, where certain groups of people and stuff are seen as naturally able to lead. We produce like supposed programs to help the poor that actually don't help the poor because they don't address the basic needs and problems that they have. Because the assumption is that they are never really going to get to the part where they are going to be the ones leading the organization. The goal is just to keep them from totally falling to the bottom, but never give them enough so that they could actually be the ones in the seats of power making the decisions. The other thing that is a huge part of fascism is an extreme fear of difference and a belief that of sort of an extreme fear of difference and a strong authoritarianism. And with Trump, that's the thing that we talk most about. But I do want to say that even though Trump inspired a lot of this discussion for the vast majority of people in this country, this has been around in various ways. Authoritarianism looks a certain way with certain people, but it can look very different and stuff with people who may exercise their power to the full extent, but not in an obvious way. But the idea that you need a strong leader, that the one strong leader is more important than the group, is pretty much the total opposite of unionization and stuff, where the idea is we as workers in a group have the ability to make decisions and to exercise democracy amongst ourselves. And so this authoritarian oversight and stuff and authoritarian thinking leaks into our work world and stuff, in terms of, like, for example, organizations where someone is the executive director for literally 100 years and nobody ever else gets to be in that decision, which comes out of this idea that certain people are to rule and certain people are not. And that the one individual strong person, that person being in power, is more important than the rights of everybody in the whole group. And I guess want to end. I don't know if I'm at my 10 minutes. I really hope I'm not. With this stereotyping of the enemy as both strong and weak. So in this country, about 5% of young adults define themselves as transgender or non-binary. But under fascist thinking, sexual minorities or gender minorities are enemies of the state. And even though this is 5% of the population, it's 5% that, can corrupt the rest of the population. If you read a lot of fascist thinking, there's this idea that even though this group is a small group, they have a corrupting influence. And therefore, your job as a good citizen, because ultimately it's all about being a good citizen and a strong citizen, is to take away the rights of these people, to ignore what they bring to the table, to not listen to them. And this affects, obviously, these young people in their everyday lives, but also in their work lives, as many of our states have no kind of discrimination, it's like laws that can, anti-discrimination laws for them. So we have young people coming into the workplace with very little support and, in fact, discriminatory situations where they will get no support. I am not sure if I'm at my 10 minutes, but I have a lot more, and I feel like we can talk about it when we get to the Q&A. So I'm going to yield my time if I am not at the end.
Well, thank you, Michelle. We appreciate yet another perspective that focus on the worker and the workplace. We do have some excellent questions, so let's get rolling with those. I'd like to first start by going back to Chuck. Now, there are some who might assert that fascism is present on the right and the left, certainly in the contemporary dialogue. public dialogue in this country, that fascism is thrown about both towards the right and towards the left. And in fact, Paul Ritchie echoes this with his question: could the USSR and North Korea be considered a form of fascism? He points out they were authoritarian governments. So, Chuck, to you, is fascism, where does it lie on the, if we have a left-right spectrum, if we ascribe to that, is it lie in one or the other, or where does it lie exactly? Where should we be concerned about it coming from beyond what we've already discussed?
There are authoritarian ideologies of the right and authoritarian ideologies of the left. And the reason that that fascism is identified on the right accurately is because it is a pro-capitalist, corporatist, neoliberal ideology. It embraces distorted forms of capitalism, unregulated forms of capitalism. And we're at an extreme point right now where billionaires are running our country. So that there is this myth of free enterprise, of freedom of choice, and so forth. That's complete bunk. We're living in a mythological society. The authoritarianism of the left tends toward it's captured by the notion that the state, increasingly, the further you go to the left, the state has a more dominant role to play over the economy. So it's the primary difference between fascism of the right and communism of the left is this notion that communism is anti-capitalist, whereas fascism is pro-capitalist in a distorted form. So that's why we place it right and left. I hope that answers the question. Is that satisfactory?
Yeah, great, Chuck. Thank you so much. And appreciate, we have a lot to get to in terms of questions and not so much time. So yeah, short and concise is great. That was great. I actually like to turn to Joe for another question. Joe, you had mentioned that how divisions on the left historically, particularly in that time between the two world wars, that the divisions on the left helped lead to fascism. Now, is that a necessary element of fascism? Can fascism rise even if the opposition is united? And how do you see that today? Is this a contributing factor today in terms of the rise of fascism, or is that not important in your mind?
Well, Nathan, that's a real good question, to which I admit at the outset I don't have any snappy comeback to, but compared, but yes, the ability of our side to make to make our majority, the fact that we're a majority, count is is very, very important, and okay, and one that the other side just doesn't have to deal with quite with the urgency that we do. I mean, if I had gone deeper into divisions of the left in the 1930s in both the Spanish Civil War and Nazi Germany, it is such a horrendously depressing tale that that as my wife Delsa just pointed out, that we ought to be talking, that we must also be talking about people like Eugene V. Debs, like W.E.B. Du Bois, like Martin Luther King, people who have devoted their entire devoted their entire life to fighting the paleo and neo-reactionary versions that we've been talking about. Okay, so so that to unite people whose interests are united, on the one hand, does have to go beyond slogans. Does have to go beyond slogans. But flesh it. But turning slow. But there is such a thing as good slogans after all. Black and white, unite and fight is one of my favorites. Okay, but even good good approaches have to be fleshed out in the real world and in practice. And and I myself find that one of the virtues of and really one of the very strong points of tonight's presentation is that we don't have any. We don't claim to have any snappy comebacks. One size fits all. That the right number of people plus the correct analysis equals victory. Nobody is saying that, which is why I urge everybody to take a good, solid, good, careful look at Chuck's 10 things you can do and to get going, because it epitomizes so beautifully the fact where we in fact are and where we need to go.
Well, very good. We'll get those 10 things you can do to fight fascism today up here in just a moment. But I did want to, well, first of all, thank you, Joe, for your answer on that as well. Do want to send a question over to Michelle, and we have a bit of interest in this. Lloyd Alterman, the New Jersey Universal Healthcare, is voiced this question. Danette Abbott Wicker seconded it, pointing out that most Americans spend their time focused on relatively mundane activities, and concerned with topics such as popular culture, sports. I would add that there's this idea that people have a finite basket of worry, right? And if you have more challenges in your life, whatever they may be, if you have certain disadvantages, if certain oppressions, that basket fills up very quickly in terms of that basket of worry. With that in mind, Michelle, how do we engage the public to be more concerned about the future of all of us as a society, particularly with regard to fascism? Oh, Michelle, you're muted.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
So I think it
All
starts by
what do you think?
pretty much exactly what you said, that there are people in this country who are struggling literally every day just to keep a roof over their head or to find a place to stay. And also to acknowledge that I personally think a lot of these things, that extra stuff that we have in our brain, is sort of manufactured to keep us from looking at things deeper. And I'm not saying that to be critical. I love movies personally. I love sports. And I'm not trying to tell people that if that is something that you spend your time enjoying, that you are not a real activist or not a real progressive or whatever. But this is a country that does not, in general, encourage very deep thinking. So I think that it doesn't reward it and stuff. If you even look at our media, the person who is the smartest or the most bookish is often considered the socially, not coordinated person. So I think it sort of starts by seeing where people are. There are people who are not looking deeply into things because they don't have access to it. And that's a specific issue where we have to talk specifically to those people. But there are other people who just really, I don't want to sound mean, they don't care. They're in an economic or social position where they're comfortable. There were people who voted for Trump who said, yeah, I know he's terrible, but my 401k is fat under him. So if that means that other people are going through stuff, that's their issue. I'm doing good. So we have to sort of look at the various groups of people and where people are. I think for myself, from working with a lot of people who are struggling financially and struggling with a lot of things, it's realizing that they have the ability to grasp these things. and stuff, and sort of talking about it to them in a language that they can understand. I work a lot of times alongside women who will never use feminist language the way I will, but they are great feminists and have really deep thoughts. And I need to acknowledge that even if they don't use the same language I use, the ideas they're expressing are pretty much the same. So it's about learning what people's language are, what people's language is, knowing where they are and how to define fascism for them in a way that they can understand and with a future. Because we want to be honest about what's going on, but we don't want a situation where people feel like, what's the point? You're telling me the government is in on this, business interests, media. Why should I even try to fight against this? Why should I even vote? So we have to have a vision of a better future and an ability to talk to multiple groups of people in a way that they can relate to and understand.
That
So I
makes
guess,
sense. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Michelle.
yeah, that's my answer. That's my
Okay.
answer.
Very good. Well, yeah, we have to meet people where they're at, right? Meet
Yeah.
people where they are, whether they don't care or whether they are facing other things that are distracting or consuming their lives, right?
Yeah, and then learn different languages, because communicating political ideas is pretty much just learning a new language. And so, how can we learn different languages to speak to different groups?
Very good. I do have a question here. I want to get out to Chuck, but I am going to paste in the chat here as well as share it that Joe had mentioned the 10 things you can do to fight fascism. And I'm going to share these up on the screen right now. Now, this list is, this link is an open link in a Google Doc. You can see here there are these 10 points take you to have various other links embedded here that you can click on to get more information. And I think I can speak for the panelists in saying that this is not a comprehensive list, but it is one that you can explore. And I welcome any of the panelists to in your follow-ups to some of these questions here, if there's any of these particular of these 10 or another that you would want to point out, please feel free to do so. But I'm going to go ahead and take that down now. But like I said, it is in the chat for you to click on and save. It'll be up indefinitely. So I would like to send the next question to Chuck. And I apologize, I don't have the name of who posted this, but the question is, how would you assess the strengths and weaknesses of the tendency, is the word they use, known as Antifa? And I can say, I'll just add myself that, well, that's the question. We'll just go to that. Chuck, what's your thoughts on Antifa?
Well, Antifa has the best sports mascot in the country, Gritty, who's associated with the Philadelphia Flyers. So that's number one. I do want to just after I finish this, I do want to just circle back and reinforce where Joe was in his response and why it is so difficult to tackle fascism. But Antifa is not an organization. We just need to let this sink in. Antifa is a tactic. Antifa is not an organization, and yet a fascist like Donald Trump flips out and freaks out at Antifa and declares them a terrorist organization. They're not an organization. There's no website, there's no building, there's no structure, there's no hierarchy. What Antifa is a tactic. It's a response. It's an organic response to perceived threats that occur. Like when a fascist leader, the Proud Boys, the Myth Keepers, the Three Percenters, the Oath Keepers, excuse me. Like when these folks show up in town, that's where Antifa pops up. It's an organic movement to stop and shut down fascism with force, because fascists only understand force. That's the theory. That's the idea behind Antifa. Antifa stands for anti-fascism, right? So does that answer the question? I
Thank
can
you.
share this. Also, just a personal story. My son was part of a Black Bloc anti-fascist march on January 20th, 2017. There were several hundred of these folks who just showed up. There were messages that came across social media. He was in high school. He jumped in a car, drove down from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, drove into DC, got in this march. There were like 900 of them. And infiltrating that march were provocateurs, whether they were Secret Service or police or FBI. And at a certain moment, they broke out from the pack and they started attacking the McDonald's and the Starbucks buildings, like throwing rocks and bricks. And suddenly, just like that, a phalanx of more than 1,000 militarized police and army soldiers came in and they just encircled this march. And then they kettled these folks. They held them for 9 hours. They took their cell phones, never gave them back, brought them up on charges. And then my son ultimately had to do a plea because he needed to get off to school. But ultimately they were allowed to go because the government violated their basic human rights. And this is something that is really important to understand, that this is the history of this country. The state will do whatever it does to protect itself. It's a raison d'etre. This is the reason of state. This is what what we face, is that the state is going to look the other way where fascism is concerned. Look at how all these white people who marched on the Capitol were treated. Oh, but if they were Black Lives Matter folks, that's what would have freaked out, all these white politicians and so forth. There's just complete double standards. So this is the challenge that we face, is that fascism folds right in with that white supremacy, the dominant force, and it folds right in with state corporatism and the neoliberalism that Michelle talked about, and it folds right in with the religious nationalism. This is what's going on. There's been a race war since day one when Columbus landed in Hispaniola in 1492. The challenge in fighting fascism is that fascism is Machiavellianism on steroids. I mean, think about this. Every tool is in the toolbox. Fascists will use whatever it takes, whatever lie, whatever instrument, whatever manipulation, whatever propaganda, whatever instrument they can find at their disposal to smash people and to smash democracy and to smash rights. And remember, this comes out of the ashes of defeat after World War I, which in full force was a hyper-nationalist response by an aggrieved set of populations, leading with Germany, Japan, and Italy, who all felt like they were aggrieved, that they had lost. And so it's fear, it's despair, it's a sense of loss and alienation. And that's what fascist ideology does, is it plays on people's weaknesses. It plays on people's fears. And so how do we respond to that? We have to create a unified center and even center right with the left. This is an extreme right ideology. And we've got to bridge ourselves, like Michelle was talking about. We have to get out of our silos. We have to connect all of our social justice movements. I put a link in the chat. We need to do the intergenerational, intersectional, cross-race, gender, class. We have to bring all of ourselves together on the basis of our shared values. And we have to understand that we're not going to agree on everything, but we have to respect the interests and the justice pursuit of each of these individual groups. You may not agree with everybody, but you need to understand that we have to stand in the shoes. We have to share the sense of injustice that people who don't look like us have experienced in this country, for centuries. That's what's going to take. It's going to take radical hospitality, which is welcoming people without judging them, and understanding that if they don't have a roof over their head, they can't begin to think about healthcare justice. They can't begin to think about climate justice. They can't begin to think about anything else but, like Michelle said, getting a roof over their head. So this is what we have to do. Radical hospitality, radical hope, and radical love. That's where the conversation begins. We build this mass movement and get folks to get out of their institutional creep and understand that there's a larger purpose here that unifies us, and that's how we're ultimately going to defeat fascism. We have to pull together. We don't have the resources. Steve Bannon is just grinning from ear to ear. He's bringing in millions and millions of dollars, and I put a link in the chat here. I think there's a Guardian story on Steve Bannon. He's in the process of putting together 34 states who are going to vote for a constitutional convention. They already have 31. They're very close to just scrapping the Constitution altogether is the right wing. And they're firing people up to go into the precinct polls this election and challenge people who don't look white, who look different from them, and challenge every one of those votes and create a backlog of voters. And this is exactly what fascism does.
Hey, Chuck.
There's no boundary. Sorry.
No. Don't mean to cut you off, but I'll allow people to explore that because I do want to we're running in. I have two quick questions I would like to answer to wrap us up here. If I could ask for Joe and Michelle to give us some quick answers here. Joe, I know you said particularly between 1870 and 1914, that the rise of fascism was concurrent with the rise of labor. And if you could speak to just a moment, take a minute, is that coincidence? And what does that mean for the present moment in terms of labor? You know, we might have a bit of a labor resurgence here. What does that mean in terms of the relationship between labor and fascism? Can you give us a 45-second to minute response on that?
Okay, short answer. Yeah, they do go together, but they are not Siamese twins. Is my snappy comeback. But I want to say something about what Chuck said. Who I agree with 85% of what he said. Okay, Washington D.C. is chock full of liberal and progressive folks like ourselves, and yet there was no attempt made to keep the streets of Washington, of our town, free from these interloping extremist, armed extremists and dangerous people. But what if there had been? What if there had been? Well, of course, we'll never know because that's not the way the things eventuated. But one possibility would have been that Trump himself would have been captured, surrounded by the people, and indicted and tried and put into jail for treason, which is at the very least what he was guilty of. Okay, well that's what didn't happen. But let me conclude by saying something in full agreement with Michelle's wonderful talk, and that is that there are certain things that our political culture is so poor and decrepit that you just never hear that the things like the fact that John Stuart Mill, the great 19th century liberal economist, said that it should never be government policy to make the rich and well-connected more comfortable and wealthy than they already are. Okay, and our side doesn't seem to be aware of that either. Then there is the crucially important thing about people, about the millions and millions of people who think that their misfortunes and the world's misfortunes are due to people less well off than themselves. I mean, the sheer illogic of that drives me wild, and I think should drive us all wild. Okay, then for those of you who are
wrap up, Joe.
Okay, the idea. Okay, the whole business of moral hazard is the most corrupt concept I've encountered in a long time. And finally, when's the last time you heard a white Democratic Party politician saying, if a policy is good for black folks, it's also good for white folks? And what that and if your answer is anything like mine, that answer is scarce as hen's teeth. What does that tell us about what we need to do?
Okay, and I would like, we do want to respect people's time here as we wrap up, but I do want to give a final question here to Michelle. And again, I'm sorry I don't have the person who asked this question, but I know Chuck had referred to tactics, Antifa as a tactic. and Michelle, I know you're obviously very grounded in the grassroots. So when we look at, those who currently have power over elections, that there are efforts to control our officials, to control what's going on in our democratic processes and undermine them, and also efforts to get members of the far right elected to school boards at the local level, to crush things like teaching about LGBTQI issues or quote unquote critical race theory. Do you see these? What is your response to these sort of tactics that are being used by fascist movements? Past, present, future. What's your response to that?
Well, my response is that we know through history and through the present the tactics that are being used, and our role and our job is to, as best we can, counter those tactics, because we know we also have a history of countering racist, oppressive tactics. I look to, even though everyone talks about Dr. King, I want to mention the great Fannie Lou Hamer, because most of us are not Dr. King. I am not. But Fannie Lou Hamer was a sharecropper and with almost no education, and she was able to be the leader of a pro-voting rights group, even though that meant that she lost her home and her job. And so I think that we need to realize that, especially within the labor movement, we have heroes who have seen oppressive tactics and come up with ideas to counter them. And we also can try to put people on school boards. Within State College, there is a group of after the shooting of a Black man by the police and various other issues we're dealing with, we put together a group of people that elected 4 progressive people to the State College and Ferguson councils and stuff, 3 of them people of color in the last election. So it can be done. It's extremely hard. It takes a lot of effort and work, but we have a history of this. We have people who have done it, and we have people who can do it. So, but we have to know what the tactics are, and we have to know what our strengths are and what we can do.
Well, very good. Thank you so much, Michelle. And I would just like to point out, first of all, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Chuck and Joe and Michelle, for joining us today, for enlightening us, for giving us a lot to think about. It was mentioned in the chat, mentioned earlier, this has been recorded, and the full recording will be available on YouTube for you to go and review. And thanks to Larry McCullough, our operations director for the Battle of Homestead Foundation, for taking care of that for us. Also like to mention a couple other things before we go. This program is free to you, and but it does cost money to host this and to put all this together. So if you haven't donated already, there is a link in the chat. Please give a little to help us keep going with programs like this into the future. Go to battleofhomestead.org for that. Also, be sure to go to the Facebook page, like Battle of Homestead Foundation. That link is in the chat as well, and that's a great place to follow the latest from Battle of Homestead Foundation. And you can sign up to get emails right in your inbox if you prefer email. That link is in the chat as well for how to sign up for emails. And of course, you can go to battleofhomestead.org as well for that. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you for everyone who has supported this organization. And we are going to go out on a song that has been, I believe this came from Joe, but the group agreed that we should share this. And I'm going to put that up here in just a second.
Both of these songs came out in 1934 when Hitler was crushing labor unions in Germany. So it was a response to that.
Okay, thank you for that context, Chuck. And thank you, everyone, once again.
weil der Mensch ein Mensch ist, drum braucht er was zum Essen, bitte sehr. Es macht ihn ein Geschwätz nicht satt, das schafft kein Essen her.
Rum, links, 2, 3, rum, links, 2, 3, wo der Platz genossen ist, weil ich ein Jahr weiter einheimst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Und weil der Mensch ein Mensch ist, drum hat der Stiefel im Gesicht nicht gern. Er will unter sich keinen Sklaven sehen und über sich keinen Herrn.
Drum links 2, 3, drum links 2, 3, wo mein Platz genossen ist, weil ich ein Jahr weiter einheimst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Und weil der Prolet ein Prolet ist, drum wird ihn kein anderer befreien. Es kann die Befreiung der Arbeiter nur das Werk der Arbeiter sein.
Drum links 2, 3, drum links